Hello everyone, and welcome to the next edition of the Holland Land Office Museum Artifact Video Series. My name is Ryan Duffy and I'm the director of the museum, and this week's video is going to be on one of the most well-known businesses from Batavia's past, that is the Wiard Plow Company. Now, the Wiard Plow Company actually gets its beginning not in Batavia, but just a little ways east in a place called Avon, New York. And its beginnings are very early on in American history, and especially in American industrial history. It was started by a man named Thomas Wiard, who started making simple bowl plows out of his home in Avon, and he began making them in 1804. With this date, he's actually one of the earliest steel plow makers in the country. And he continued to make plows out of his home in Avon, and eventually in 1817 actually built his own foundry where he could make a larger quantity of plows and sell them to a larger group of people. And over time, the foundry grew and became more prosperous and actually stayed in the family for another 2 generations before Batavia starts to come into the process. Thomas's grandson, George, is the one who eventually takes over the foundry, and it is George that brings Wiard plows to Batavia. However, there's a little bit of a gap in between from when George takes over until he brings the plant to Batavia. He first tries to build a plant in Oakfield in 1859, but that soon closes down due to the onset of the Civil War. With the Civil War coming, George actually enlists and serves throughout pretty much the entirety of the war. He actually enlists in the 129th New York Volunteer Infantry, which later becomes the 8th New York Heavy Artillery, and serves with distinction throughout the war, eventually reaching the rank of lieutenant. And he is wounded during the war. However, after the war, he is able to continue his economic pursuits. Eventually, he moves back to Avon after the war and continues working with the plow company. However, the plow company eventually outgrows their station at Avon and is looking for bigger and better plants and places to produce. Eventually, by the 1870s, they set their sights on Batavia. Now, the reason the Wiards even consider Batavia is for the strong central hub of many of the major railroads throughout New York State. So coming to Batavia was a boom because you could get your product out very fast, very quickly, very cheaply, which is a definite plus, especially in major equipment like farm equipment. So by 1878, they approach the powers that be in Batavia looking for a spot in order to place their factory, and eventually a spot is settled on Swan Street. And this spot becomes their factory for the next 75 years, basically. The people of Batavia were so happy to have a company like Wiard Plow Company come to Batavia that they actually raised the funds to purchase the land for the company so that they would stay. And this created a very healthy, long relationship between Batavia and the Wiard Plow Company. And it would stay here until 1954. And it would actually stay with the Wiards for nearly that entire time. Eventually it would pass down from George unto Henry, who would be the last Wiard to really be in charge of the Wiard Plow Company in Batavia. However, there was also another family involved in the Wiard Plow Company. This was the Huff family. George Wiard, before he moved to Batavia, actually joined forces with a man named Charles Huff, and eventually their 2 families got together to grow the business, with the Huffs often being in charge of more of the business side, with the Wiards being in charge of the manufacturing side. And this continued basically throughout the entirety of the company. As I mentioned, Henry Wiard was the last Wiard to own it, and he was the one who actually sold the business around 1950. And they sold it to a conglomerate out of New Albion, Michigan, who sought to reinvigorate the business as it had fallen on some hard times due to the lack of want of agricultural equipment, the rise in steel, and I think just the overall wariness of the family in order to maintain it. However, they kept Henry on as the plant manager, but the glory of a bright new future did not last very long. The company of New Albion was interested in producing Wiard plows, machinery from a Leroy factory, as well as joining forces with another Batavia company, Massey Harris, to make chilled steel plows for some of their machines. However, it just wasn't meant to be, as they had to raise $100,000 just to pay off their debts to investors in order to get back going, and it just didn't happen. The time for the plow company had just disappeared, essentially. And by 1954, the company applied for bankruptcy and really was no more. As you can see in the background, I have one of the sign from Wiard Plow Company. It's just a little piece of Americana showing off the name and its advertising. But more importantly, we actually have a Wiard plow on display here. One of the early ones made while here in Batavia. It was made in the late 1870s or early 1880s. It's a number 10, which is one of the earlier models. And this is before, as you can see, it still has a wooden frame, and it's before we see the more modern styles of plows, but this is a classic Wiard plow and a classic piece of Batavian history. Now, Wiard plows was one of the central pieces to Batavia's manufacturing, particularly agricultural manufacturing boom that happened in the latter quarter of the 19th century and throughout the first half of the 20th century. You had businesses like Wiard Plows, Massey Harris, which became from Johnson Harvester, Bidwell Thresher, among others. All of these companies were the main employers in Batavia and were the main producers of much of the agricultural equipment, not only in the United States, but throughout the Western Hemisphere. So I think it's very important to understand the importance of a company like Wiard Plow Company and its pivotal nature in helping Batavia grow. Well, I hope you enjoyed this edition of the Artifact video series. If you've missed our previous ones, we're continuing to rack up the videos on this, so please go back and check out the others. And I hope you stay tuned for future ones, as they'll be coming out every week.